Hey everyone, how you doing today?
Good. How you doing?
Good. Welcome to class 5 of Audio MIDI 1, spring 2023. Time is just flying. Hopefully we'll get more participants as we get into this. I wanted to start off while we're waiting for people to get here with a couple of things just to expose you to some stuff. I'm not sure how many of you have actually released music. Have any of you released music yet yourself?
You mean like on Apple, Spotify,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
yeah,
Okay, so then you probably know the basics of doing it, right? Um, there's I'm not going to talk about how to get stuff on the all the streaming services, but I want to show you what your personal Spotify for artists looks like for those of you that have the idea that you might actually release music someday. Because while I personally understand the argument against somebody's mic is on. Okay, good. While I understand the argument against Spotify, and I do agree that Spotify and Apple and all the streaming services, except maybe Tidal, pay way, way, way too little per stream, it is the way that music is consumed right now. And the negative part about that is that a whole generation of people starting maybe 15 years ago, they don't understand the actual idea about ownership of music. When I was growing up, I went to the record store and I bought albums. And I had by the early 1990s, I owned 800 to 1,000 albums. And I didn't buy them all at once, and I also owned at that point probably 300 or 400 CDs or 500 CDs. And a lot of the CDs I owned were repeats of some of the albums I had that were just way too scratchy to play because I played them so much. And I owned all that music, and Mercy did too. Okay, great. Thank you, you guys. People don't own music right now unless they're buying actually vinyl again, right? That's the big thing. And I hear the audio cassettes are making a comeback, which is really beyond the pale to me because I never liked audio cassettes as a medium to consume music on. Let me just flip to here. So this is Spotify for artists. Whoops, there we go. And I have to say that I have been negligent until about a year ago with trying to build up my streaming numbers, right? I was concerned with getting my music onto Sirius XM, and I've got 13 tracks on their spa channel that are, which is sort of the ambient music, instrumental music channel, where they've been in steady rotation. I got my first tracks on there in 2015, and that pays me a nice monthly stipend, right? It's like a nice part-time job. Spotify, I get paid every month from Spotify, but it's 10% of what I'm getting from Sirius XM. So my entire focus of the commercial part of my music release was getting tracks, as many as I could, from my albums onto Sirius XM. But I've sort of learned in the interim that it's best to have a more balanced approach where I'm paying attention to this. So this is my Spotify for artists. And I have, if we look right over here, I've got my name as an artist, and then I've got a couple of other imprints. And I haven't really focused on this, but I've focused on this one here. So this is my main page, and you can see that 9 people are listening to me now. And then over the last 7 days, I've had a little over 8,000 listeners and a little under 13,000 streams, and I've got 727 followers. And then here are my top songs over the past week. And then these are the top playlists. Now, and then there's a bunch of other information here. Some of it is tips for getting more playlists, more streams. So what you can do right here is I can click on music, and it will show you my catalog right here. And you can see this is set up for the last 28 days. My biggest track is something called Back Alley Blues. And it's gotten 42,000 streams with 23,000 listeners. And 4,600 people have looked at my profile. And it's got almost like 900 saves. That's just in the past 28 days. And then you could see these are my most played tracks. Now, this track, Sunset Sky and Inner Secrets, these two tracks, I released these in 2016, I believe. And they're still getting a couple thousand, 1,600 streams a month, right? Now, we can go a little deeper into this, and we could go to releases. And so let's scroll down and see if I can find that Backstreet Blues. And this is something that I improvised on the piano when I recorded it. So literally the performance, that's how long that it took me to write and record this tune. It's just completely improvised blues, right? So this is over the past 28 days. It's been added to 1,356 playlists, and that's where you get your streams, by getting things on playlists. This was added to Spotify has their own. So playlists are on Spotify are done by people who curate the playlists. You could be a playlist curator, right? And if you do a good job with that, you learn how to do it. It can increase your own visibility on Spotify, as well as helping out other artists. Now, Spotify does algorithmic playlists and editorial playlists. This song got onto a big editorial playlist, which I'll show you in a second. So if I look at this for the lifetime, last 12 months, 132,000 streams, 34,000 playlists. And you can see this is the number of streams. Now, this got released a year ago, and it was doing pretty well, getting a couple hundred plays because it was on a Spotify playlist. Something happened on this date here. Let's see if I can zoom in on this. On one day, I got almost 4,859 plays in one day. I have no idea what happened, but the algorithmic playlist, one of the algorithmic playlists that this got onto, something happened and it just got an insane amount of plays, right? So I don't know what that is. Now, if I go back here and I go to this, which is my other imprint. This is Pete Calandra and Straight Up. So the first one is sort of piano-based, ambient orchestral music with also electronic music. It's what I've been doing for about the past 6 or 7 years in my own personal music. This Straight Up bit is jazz funk, and I have Antonio playing on a couple of songs. Dennis, Professor Matt McCrell is playing on a couple of songs, and so I've been enjoying this, but I've only been doing this for about a year. And so if we go to the audience, right, with this one, I've got only about 13,000 monthly listeners. So between my two imprints, I've got about 46,000 monthly listeners. But I've got 35,000 streams here and 64,000 streams on my other things in a month. So I'm almost up to 100,000 streams a month. And that's the deal, 1 million streams, if you own every cent of your music on Spotify, will pay you about $4,000, right? So in the past month, I've made about $400 here on Spotify, right? Not great, but compared to a year ago, it's a lot better. And I have friends that actually have a nice ancillary income from this. And then it also helps to drive sheet music sales because many of these people are just solo pianists, like new age pianists, right? So I have a friend, Karen Beal, who's actually, I don't know how, she's friends with a former professor at Queens College who's retired, Dr. Brings. He was a theory teacher and a composer when I was an undergraduate student. So I don't know how she's friends with him and his wife, but she is, and she gets about 8 or 9 million streams a year, right? So you multiply that 4,000 times that, and she's getting like in the mid to high $30,000 a year of income just for this. But then she sells another $5,000 or $6,000 in sheet music every year generated from this. But her music is very specific, and she had an idea as to what her audience was when she put out music. And she's been doing this for 5-6 years. And she curates her own playlists, and she's got like several playlists that have, 60, 70, 80,000 followers. And she sprinkles her music on there. A couple of my tracks are on her playlists, other friends of out, mutual friends, and other well-known artists. And so she gets these playlists up there, and they get a following, and they not only drive, they not only get people to listen to it, but they also drive up her numbers because she sprinkles her tracks throughout the playlist. So, that's it. But let me take a look at music here, because I released a track 7 days ago called Bleecker Street. And if I click here, so this track got put onto a big Spotify editorial playlist for smooth jazz. So in the past week, it's gotten almost 4,000 streams, which is more than I think any track I've had that I've released. So that's pretty cool. And let's see. So let's go back here and go to releases, and let's click. Is it here? Yeah. So in the past week, well, this is not accurate. The number is 3,800, but because this is a little behind when you look at this view, but 347 playlist ads. It's pretty good. So, you do this long enough. I'm going to be doing this for the next few years. I'm hoping that I can keep growing this, and that it will get more people to listen to my music and bring me in some revenues, because, for a vast portion of my career, thank you, Mercy, for a vast portion of my career as a composer, which let's say it started in 1997 when I started making the transition from being a full-time keyboard player to being a full-time composer and a part-time keyboard player. Up until about maybe 5 or 6 years ago, my focus was getting music on television, right? And I got it to the point where I had music on television 400 or 500 times a day, and I could have easily lived on the BMI royalties that I was getting from that. And that's something that I will discuss in the course of these classes. I do like to give you a little bit of my take on business, because, I'm relatively unknown in a lot of ways, right? In the general idea, like I'm not Hans Zimmer. I've scored 100 films, but I don't have the name of Hans Zimmer. I put out albums, but I'm not Ludovico Einaudi, who's a very famous contemporary European neoclassical composer. I put out these jazz funk things, but I'm not Jeff Lorber or Bob James or Joe Sample or any of these guys, right? I'm not known in that stuff. I am more well known now than I was 5 years ago. But the thing is that I've always worked, and I've earned a really good living for my entire adult life doing music. And there's a reason for that, there's a lot of reasons for that, but I have a different take on this than you might get from anywhere, because I've had a very wide experience in terms of the kinds of avenues I've worked in. I'm very comfortable talking about how to make a living as a player. I'm very comfortable talking about how to make a living as a film TV composer. And I'm getting more comfortable talking about how to make a living as a independent artist. It's not easy to do any of those things. But what I think that everybody needs to do is what I'm sort of doing now, right? I've made a transition over the past few years where I stopped playing piano for a living in 2017. I just didn't like playing on Broadway for a decade, but I held on just to keep doing it. And, because it was an easy paycheck, and I was working as a substitute 3 times a week, 4 times a week. And I've stopped doing a lot of the things that I did to make a living as a TV and film composer. But what I'm doing now is a little bit more balanced. I teach part-time. I get a couple of film projects to work on a year instead of having sometimes 2 or 3 projects going on at once. And I put out my own music. And so that balance. And I would like to start performing live again, but not on Broadway. You know, I just don't want to do that ever again. I miss my friends, but I don't miss the work. But when I was young, your age, I loved it. You know, I was in a really great show when I was in my 20s called Little Shop of Horrors, and it was incredibly fun. It was in the East Village at the Orpheum Theater, and it was in a small theater. It was sort of like the It show for a couple of years. All the big celebrities used to come and see it, you know, of that time, like Jamie Lee Curtis, Eddie Murphy, people like Lucille Ball and Jackie Gleason, Carol Channing, Robert Redford, the woman who starred in Annie Hall with Woody Allen, Diane Keaton. I met Yoko Ono there. I mean, you know, she would. It was just her 90th birthday, and I just made this story on my Facebook page. It was like 84 or 85. The show ran from 82 to 87. And there was a period of about 2 months where she brought her son, Sean, to the Sunday matinee, maybe not every week, but a lot, like 6 or 7 times over the course of 2 months. He really loved it. And she would get the director, the late Howard Ashman's house seats. And if I was playing piano here, which is right in the house, and the stage was right in front of us, and I had audience members like 2 feet in back of me, she was about, you know, twice the distance to that door back there away from me. So between acts, I saw her sitting there, and she was looking in the playbill, and I walked over and said, "Hey, I'm playing piano and conducting the show. Just wanted to tell you that I really appreciate you coming every week. Sean seems to like the show. I hope that we're making it enjoyable for you guys." And she was very nice and very gracious, but it was really like a trip, you know. You get these, when I was growing up, the whole thing was that, you know, Yoko was breaking up the Beatles, and everybody hated her, and she was this witch, and it's like the furthest from the truth, you know. It's just really interesting. All right, so let's be done with that, and let's move on to the lesson, and then I've got some videos to play for you later on. So the lesson's going to start with us talking about MIDI. Okay, so today we're going to do a brief history of MIDI. And I like to give you guys, in all of my classes, I think it's really important, and I've said this before, to know where things come from. They didn't just develop out of nowhere, right? There's a reason for things being developed. Music technology developed in a certain way. I in Audio MIDI 2, I do like a little history of the recording studio presentation. In the other classes, I did a history of tape echo. I did a history of studio reverb and everything. So it's really interesting. So a brief history of MIDI, and we'll get into what MIDI is in a second, but give me one more second to set one more thing up. All right. So you know, right now, the way the world is, it's really difficult to imagine a world without MIDI. And what MIDI means is musical instrument digital interface. And it's so ubiquitous now, it's used in so many parts of the performing arts that it's hard to believe that before 1983, this didn't exist. And it's, for me, it's basically my whole adult life. It's been around. So what happened was that in the late 70s and early 80s, there was an act of collaboration between music technology competitors. And this collaboration heralded maybe the most important music technology of the 20th century. And so we'll go back to the 1970s. And in the 1970s, you had very expensive instruments from ARP, which stands for Alan R. Perlman. And he was the guy who owned the company that manufactured the ARP 2600. Moog, which is Robert A. Moog, and he manufactured the System 55. And then this is in the 60s, and then the Mini Moog. There was an instrument before the ARP 2600, and there were only a handful of them made. It's called the ARP 2500. But the one that was the most popular, and we're going to listen to examples of these things, is the ARP 2600. Now, I personally own a mini Moog, and I own a modern recreation of the 2600. I did own one that was full size like this, but I traded it in when Korg came out with the licensed smaller version, because this is huge and it took up so much space in my studio that the other one, it's the sound that I'm interested in, and they sounded the same. So technology was advancing, and then companies like Korg and even ARP came out with instruments that had less features, still a great sound, but were much less expensive. These things were in the thousands and thousands of dollars. These instruments were in the hundreds of dollars. So you had the ARP Pro Soloist, you had the Mini Korg, and these are original images. This is a recreation that just came out. So the Mini Korg, and if you look at these instruments, right, they're filled with lots of knobs, and this is a modular device, so there's patch points. This is semi-modular, so there's sliders and things like that, and some knobs that turn things on and off, and then there are also patch points here. This is completely pre-wired, and that's what made this really, really, really popular, and it's still incredibly popular and in use now. And Moog just came out with a reissue of this that's going for $5,000 right now. Okay, so these were in the hundreds of dollars, and I owned this one here, the Maxi Korg, when I was your age, playing in bar bands in like 1980, 81, 82. I had a Rhodes and this is great. You could play, most of these are monophonic, meaning they play one note at a time. But the Maxi Korg, which is this here, you could play two notes at a time. So if we were doing a song by the Doors, I could actually get that fake cheesy Vox Continental organ sound. And if I was really careful about playing things, I could do stuff, boot, bop, and bop, and bop, and bop, and bop. I could make it, right, sound exactly like that, and just being clever. And then there were songs by the band Cars called Just What I Needed that had a big synthesizer solo at the end. I was able to recreate that exactly with this. And then I actually own a desktop version of this computer, of this synthesizer now, the Korg MS-20. This is in 1978, and this is a semi-modular as well, but not expensive. So they started making things for the masses, right? Now, at this point, there were already ways of communicating between instruments, and the most widespread was CV, or control voltage. So what does that mean? So that means that theoretically, you could take a patch cable out of this instrument here and patch it into one of the patch points here and use a functionality from here to control the sound here, right? The problem with that is that CV instruments worked well internally, like you could patch point anything in here and it would work really great, but they had different standards of using the control voltage. So in other words, this might have 1 volt per octave, right? So if you wanted to go from a middle C to up an octave, you would add 1 volt to the current that was changing the oscillator. And then this one might have half a volt per octave. Well, definitely this one here, the Korg, this definitely used half a volt per octave. So you couldn't use this, even though it has patch points, with the Moog or the ARP, really. So something needed to be standardized, right? So now the next thing that happened was the implementation of a computer chip. All of these synthesizers and these synthesizers, they are all analog, 100% analog. Even though these have presets, they're hardwired inside, right? These don't have as many parameters to play around with as these, right? But these sounded good, and these are mostly used because these are monophonic, as is this. This might be paraphonic, 2-voice. Yeah, you could consider this paraphonic. You could play 2 notes at a time on this. But And by 2 notes at a time, I mean you could play 2 different keys, not tuning the oscillators to 2 different pitches. But this and this were used mostly for playing lead lines. Then in 1976, a company called Oberheim made, and this guy, Tom Oberheim, is still alive. He's in his 80s and he's still working and putting out instruments. He's really an amazing human being. His life story is incredible. He came out with something called the 8 voice. And what this is each one of these little boxes here contains an individual synthesizer, complete with 2 oscillators, a filter, resonance, and different waveforms, envelopes, etc., etc. So you could play 8 notes at a time on this, and each note have a different timbre, which is kind of cool. It also had, right in this area here, you could save 8 preset sounds. This was a little cumbersome because you could change that preset sound and it could still, these oscillators could be out of tune with each other, right? It was really a little cumbersome, but I'm going to show you an example of how this was used in, this was used by Joe Zawinul and by Lyle Mays. Joe Zawinul with Weather Report and Lyle Mays with the Pat Metheny Group. But this here is the instrument. This is called the Prophet 5, and this came out in 1978, and this is a polyphonic synthesizer. You could play 5 notes at a time on this, and it also had memory. And I think this had 8 times 10, maybe 90. Maybe there was some banks that you could select, but about, let's say that there was somewhere between 60 and 100 presets you could save here. Now, why is that good? Well, you could set this up, and you could set this up so that if you were doing a live show with a pop act, right, you'd have your set list would be the same every night pretty much. And you could set up song 1 so that you could set it up so that patch 1 starts the song, and then maybe in the bridge you have to change to a different sound. Patch 2 would be that, and then maybe you go back to the original sound. Patch 3 would be that, and you could just keep incrementing, like going up incrementally by 1 step to go through the entire show. And you could have all those sounds saved in a row there, and you could reprogram it and everything. And it was just like, this is on so many records in the late 70s and all through the 80s. It was a big thing. I didn't own one of these. I own what's called a 2-voice Pro. So it's just 2 of these and a keyboard. It's got incredible sound. But I certainly played this many times. The summer of 1984, I was in the Radio City Music Hall Orchestra, at Radio City, playing the summer show there. So it was 13 weeks, 2 shows a day, and we had a 45-piece orchestra, and I played synthesizers, and there was a pianist as well. And Radio City owned one of these things, and I played it to do some doubling of the strings, some synthesizer melody work. But the big thing was that this had a great thunder and rainstorm program that was in the presets. And we did a cover of this song called It's Raining Men by the Weather Girls. And I used to do all the, the thunder and lightning. All right. So now this guy here is Dave Smith. He invented this. He just passed away late last year. Like suddenly he was in great shape, and I don't know what happened to him, but he was, it came as a shock to everybody. He was really ubiquitous at all the trade shows and everything. He's the main inventor of MIDI. And the reason that was possible is that the memory in this one contained a computer chip. So it started getting digital information, not to control the actual formation of the sound, but to control like the parameters, where the parameters were set. And so he is like basically the father of MIDI. Now we can go here, and in December of 1982, Sequential Circuits, which is his company, Roland, huge musical instrument company, Yamaha, huge company, Korg, and Kawai, they collaborated to create MIDI, musical instrument digital interface. And they showed it at the NAMM. They showed it at the NAMM show a month later. So basically what you'd have is a cable that had a 5-pin DIN connection. So you could see that in this little receptacle here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pins, and they get inserted into these 5 pins, or these 5 pins, or these 5 pins. So on the back of these keyboards that started coming out in the early 80s, you would have something that looked like this. You'd have MIDI in, which means that this would receive information from another source. MIDI out, meaning that the information that you would be playing, let's say from this keyboard, would be sent to another keyboard. And MIDI through. MIDI through meant like if you got information from one keyboard, it could come in on different channels. So maybe channel 1 would affect this keyboard, and you could also have information on channel 2. So you could daisy chain this with another instrument, drum machine or synthesizer, and that would be set to channel 2, and that would receive different information. And that's basically how I learned how to do everything that I'm teaching you here. I had a hardware sequencer, and I had a bunch of keyboards, and I would daisy chain. Like, let's say I had a Roland Juno 106, I had a Yamaha DX7, and I had a Sonic Mirage, I had a drum machine, and I would just do MIDI out from my little hardware sequencer to MIDI in of one of those keyboards, then MIDI through from that keyboard to MIDI in of the second keyboard, MIDI through from that keyboard to MIDI in of the third keyboard, and et cetera, et cetera. And each one of those keyboards would be set to a different MIDI channel. And on my sequencer, I would have different stuff playing on different MIDI channels. So those are just like tracks in Pro Tools. So you see how everything sort of developed, right? There's something analogous to what we're using in Pro Tools. It just changed a little bit with this stuff here. So basically, these are the first two instruments that were demonstrated MIDI. And this is, I believe this was in January of 1983 at the NAMM show in California. So Dave Smith had his Prophet 600 and Roland had a Jupiter 6, and they took one of those cables, the out from the MIDI out to the MIDI in, and they played something on the Prophet 600, and you would hear sound coming out of this instrument. And that was revolutionary at the time. Another big instrument of that time was the DX7, and this was fully digital. Like, these instruments had analog sound engines, but digital, but they were controlled digitally, similar to the Prophet 5, except these guys could talk to each other, right? But this was completely digital, and I actually owned one of the first ones in New York City in early 1984, and I used this all throughout the 80s for recordings, for live gigs. These were ubiquitous. This has probably sold more instruments than any other synthesizer in history. Yamaha made a fortune from this. But this is completely digital. So there's a computer in here that can create sine waves, and FM sine waves, you have things called operators and modulators, and they would combine together in these forms here, which are algorithms, and that would create the sound. This whole FM, frequency modulation synthesis, was invented by a guy named John Chowning at Stanford University, and he patented it, and he and the Stanford received money from licensing fees even to this day, right? So, yeah. Okay. Now, eventually hardware sequencers left, and you started having MIDI with computers. So this would be a typical early MIDI connections. You'd have the audio outputs going to a mixer. You'd have your synthesizer. You'd have MIDI out going to this interface, and MIDI in coming from this interface. And then going from the MIDI interface to the computer was something called a serial cable, right? Which looked a little bit like that 5-pin DIN. There was no USB. This is pre-USB, Firewire, Thunderbolt, all the protocols, Ethernet, all that stuff. Serial. That's SERIAL. So what would happen is that you would play something on this keyboard, and then it would go through this interface. There'd no audio going through this interface, just computer information, like commands, on and off, how long the note is, what pitch it is. And then that would get recorded into the computer on a DAW, not like Pro Tools, but the antecedents to Pro Tools, something like, and some of those sequencers are still in existence today. Cubase and Logic and Digital Performer back then were in existence. I used something called Vision, and basically it was like a word processor in terms of the way it functioned. It would store MIDI commands and shoot it back out to that instrument, and then the instrument would play notes back, and you'd hear it through your audio system, right? So this is another way, right? You'd have MIDI interface, MIDI in, you'd have a DAW, and you could do this, laptops had serial ports also. Now, right, and this is just another way where you'd have two different instruments playing back. So this instrument here is called a D110. I actually owned one of these. They were very popular in the late 80s. And this was something called a multi-timbral rompler. And rompler means that it has read-only memory, and it basically stores samples, audio files of sounds inside of read-only memory, and it plays it back. That's the same kind of technology that Xpand 2 uses, except this was in its infancy. This, you could play, I think, 8-channel polyphony, so another 8-channel multi-timbral. So I could have drums, bass, strings, keyboards, all on different MIDI channels coming out of this tiny little unit here. And look at, this is the size of the screen, like this is my phone, right? This is just an iPhone 14. That screen was like as big as like this little square here. You had to it was very, very confusing because there was no YouTube. You couldn't there was no teaching of this stuff. It was read the manual and fool around until you figured it out, right? It was very difficult to learn this stuff back then. Eventually, USB came on the scene, and MIDI started being transmitted over USB. But most instruments still have this, and most audio interfaces still have a lot of audio interfaces still have a MIDI bit. And the reason for that, excuse me, is that let's say you're doing a big show at Madison Square Garden. You're Beyonce, right? And you've got your show all done. You've got your choreography. You've got lights. You've got, set changes. You've got costume changes. Well, you're playing possibly with a band, but you're also playing with tracks. So under the stage somewhere is a person, a guy or a woman, with a computer setup and an audio interface shooting out tracks in a sequencer. Most likely Digital Performer is what's used for a lot of these because it's very sophisticated with MIDI. And you're sending out audio, and you're also sending MIDI out of your audio interface, and that is going to control the lights. So the lights and all these things, like even scene changes on a mixer, right, can be controlled through MIDI CC messages. So MIDI is like, it's an amazing technology. And eventually in the next few years, they're going to upgrade the spec to MIDI 2.0, and it's going to increase the resolution and make it, build, and hopefully it'll be better than it is now. Okay. So next thing I want to do is I want to show you the evolution of my studios. So this is the first time I moved out. I've always had like a space in my apartment since I lived in Park Slope in 1982 and then in Prospect Heights like in 1987. And then I lived on the Upper West Side for a while, and I always had spaces in my apartment. And then as I got busy writing music in the late 80s and early 90s and early 2000s, I eventually moved into a larger post-production studio in Midtown. And so this is my room, and this is the first little setup I had. And if we zoom in here, you see I have an old school computer. And right here, I have a rack filled with, there's 5 sampler instruments in here. These top 3 ones, which is very fuzzy, these are called K2500s made by Kurzweil. And then there's 2 Roland S760s. And down here are my hard drives. These were called optical hard drives. They were these big optical discs that you could store your programs on so that you could recall stuff. They were expensive. And for me to load up, an orchestral session would take me half an hour because it was very slow. And then I also had up here a TV screen because that was used to program the Roland S760s. And this was my first audio interface right here. It's a Digidesign, which is the precursor of Avid. They owned Pro Tools before Avid. This is a Digi 001. And this was my mixer. This is a Yamaha O2R. This was a big expense for me. I paid $6,000 for this, but it was worth it. So, there's every one of these devices, these 5 samplers, they all had a MIDI cable going into something like this. Well, this is a Studio 4. So I had 2 of these, right? And if you look on the back, in the front, there's 2 MIDI in and MIDI out. And on the back, there's more MIDI in and MIDI out. And so all of my keyboards were plugged into these. And then it had you could run 2 of these together. You could bundle them up together so that they became one big interface. And then they had these serial cables here that went to and from your computer. And so everything would come into here. You program this, which was really difficult. And that's how you would get all of your stuff to sound. So eventually, a few years later, I upgraded my setup. And here I'm still using that stuff, but I'm more computer oriented now. So I've got my Mac Pro in here and my Mac, I think it was a G3 at this point. Yeah, because I didn't get a G4. I went to a G5. And I had something in here called a Giga Studio. And what a Giga Studio was, it was like, there's a software that we use called Contact. It was like Contact based inside of a PC. So I had a dedicated non-Apple computer just to run Giga Studio. And I had somebody set it up for me, and then that all got routed into my mixer over here. And then this screen here is for the PC, and this is running Giga Studio. So I could run 16 instruments on different MIDI channels, and as long as I had RAM, I could run 16 times 16. So 16 channels of 16 slots of instruments. And then all of that with these other, you don't see the Kurzweils and the Rolands anymore. So you see my setup became much slicker and much cleaner. You don't see any sound treatment in this room though, which is really bad. And then I have less keyboards also. So then now I moved out of there around 2007. And this was the setup I had in my York Avenue apartment in a tiny space. And so I had something still had my Giga Studio, and I had this thing called Vienna Ensemble right here. And that I ran inside of an iMac. And you can see this is I scored a bunch of movies in this setup. This worked well in a tiny little space I had. Then we moved over to West End Avenue. I had a bigger space. And then this is my setup. And I'm starting to get analog synths. And then I had my computer, and I had 2 Giga Studio computers in the foyer off to the left here so that I wouldn't hear the spinning fan. But you see, it just gets more compact. And then at that time, I also had a cottage in the Catskills, a cabin, and I built a little studio there. And I just used to bring up a Mac Mini and leave it there and run. I could run Pro Tools sessions and work up there. Couldn't do a lot, but enough when I'm away, not supposed to be working, I'd still be working. But now this is my space currently where I live, right? It's very sophisticated. I've got a lot of analog synthesizers, but everything is done inside of this computer here, which is a 2019 Mac Pro. So I could just use this, a MIDI keyboard, and some headphones, and I could score movies. I could get tons of sound out of that, but I like the way that these instruments sound, so I use them. All right, so enough of that. Let's talk about how MIDI works, all right? So MIDI works by transmitting a digital signal, or what's known as an event message. This message carries basic instructions. Those instructions could be note where the note starts, where the note stops, or a note start and a note stop. If it's on inside of a sequencer, where in the timeline that note starts and stops. Note number and velocity, right? So the note number is the pitch and the velocity. We looked at that. We've been looking at that. So you know what that is. MIDI is an open source. So they didn't release it fully fleshed out. Open source means that other people can get a hold of the code and they can add to it. So the MIDI spec quickly grew. So other functions controlled by MIDI are expression, volume, and pan. We've looked at that a little bit. And modulation and pitch bend and aftertouch are more of those parameters that are controlled, and program change. So you can actually change patches on a synthesizer. So these additional functions are called MIDI CCs because they occur over time. They give the illusion of being a continuous controller because they're not. They're ones and zeros. They're on and off. It's just that there's so many of them. When you look at the CC line, it looks like a curve. We've seen that in the expression lane when I showed you that. Note start and stop, note number and velocity. These are events. They happen once. You hit a note, it's done. You let go of the note, it stops. Right? The pitch is a note number. You hit the note, it's an event. And velocity, you hit it, and that's the velocity of that note. So those are called events. And that's part of what we've been working on mostly with MIDI editing is editing MIDI events. And I'm going to show you today how to do more advanced and more automated versions of that. So things like expression, volume, pan, modulation, that's what typically adds velocity, vibrato to a sound, pitch bend, aftertouch. These additional functions are called MIDI CCs. This originally meant control change, right? But now people are calling that continuous controllers, which is actually a fairly accurate description of what they do. You're controlling sound continuously. And there are 127 levels in the MIDI spec. So you can have a velocity of, it's weird because it's 127, but it starts at 0 and ends at 127. So it's actually 128 digits, right? Anyway, there are 127 levels in the MIDI spec. If we take velocity, for example, velocity usually controls the volume of an individual note. You can program velocity to do other things as well, so that you could program, let's say, a string sound, so that if you play at velocity anything below 50, it's a sustained note, and anything above 50, it switches to tremolo, let's say 50 to 100, and then from 101 to 127, it could do a trill, right? So you could program velocity to do all sorts of stuff, but that's done inside of the sound generating device. Okay, so typically it's used volume of an individual note. There are 120 steps of dynamics with velocity of 1 or 0 being soft and 127 being the loudest. Right, and as I said before, this gets a little confusing as there's a MIDI value of 0, which adds a 128th digit to the spec. In DAWs, velocity is represented in some sort of variation of a stalk. This is sort of looks like what Pro Tools, the velocity on Pro Tools looks like, and every DAW has something similar to this. So that's the this. Let's take a little listen quickly to 70s synths. All right. So let's take a listen to, and we're not going to listen to these songs completely. And on the uploaded version of this, I will post links to these songs in the description box, but I'm going to cut them out because these are copyrighted materials and it could get my video. Okay, give me a second, Andrew, and then we'll get to you. Now, before we get into this, right, last week I was talking about transposing notes using the using this stuff here and this stuff here. And Daniel brought up another command, and yes, there are, the point being that there are multiple ways to do the same thing. And I want to show you that there are different methods to get the same result in every DAW. And the more of these things you know, you sort of, the more experience you get with this stuff, you get sort of an intuition as to what is the best method to get the result that you want, right? So, for example, if I want to record an instrument, well, in stereo, there's multiple ways to record an instrument in stereo. There's equally spaced mics. There's coincident, which is sort of an XY pattern. There's ORTF, which sort of is like this. There's mid-side, where you have a microphone sort of set up like this. And then there's something called Blumline, where you have microphones set up like this. Each one of those records stereo, right? Well, it depends on what you're doing, where you're recording, and what your desired end result is as to which one is the best solution for that particular issue. And it's the same with editing MIDI and Pro Tools. The more, or any DAW, the more of these things you know, the better off you'll be. Okay, one thing I wanted to get to first before I start doing these things is that Andrew had something where the clip was a different color than the track. Correct?
Yes.
Okay, so if you've gone to your setup and to your preferences, and you've got everything set up here like we're supposed to have it set up, where your default track color coding is tracks and MIDI channels, and your default clip color coding is the track color. So what this means is that the track and right, your default track color coding, you have it set up for tracks and MIDI channels. So that means that this is generally controlling the color, but then you go down here to the clip so that anything individually can be set up for track color. Then all of these will be the same. There are all these other options here, and these options have their uses. So, let's say that you're writing a pop tune and you've got verse, chorus, bridge. You could have all of your different sections color coordinated, not your tracks, but your different sections. And this lets you know where you are. And if you want to copy the chorus and move it somewhere else, you could just copy all those things in the color. So there's definitely different ways of organizing things. Everyone has their uses. I've made it simple for you by telling you what you should be doing for this class. But let's say you've got this and this is a different color than your track. Well, if you open this up, the color palette, right here, you've got a rectangle with a downward facing triangle. You can go right here and you have all these options. So if I want to have my clips and tracks be different, I can do this and boom, you see how that's purple and that's blue. Now I can go back to where it was before, which I think is something like that. And that's pretty cool. Now, so that's how you would fix it. So if you can't fix it, you would go there and you go clips and tracks, and you'd make sure, like, so in other words, you go tracks, you click on this, you see right here, it's this box. If you go here and it's something like this, you know that the track is this box here. You go to clips and tracks, boom. Right like that. And that'll fix that. Now, the other thing too is that you can make your markers be color coordinated, right? So markers, this is kind of like, let's see, let me just see something here. So I've selected this, and you notice this is like a peachy red color, and this is purple. Okay, so if I go to markers right there, it says that it's purple. Well, I just make it this peachy red, and you see now my markers are color coordinated with the clip. So you could do all sorts of work with color palette. I just try to keep that simple for everybody. Okay, and then Andrew, what was the other question you had?
Well, so the when I was looking at the picture, what happened was I must have pressed something randomly, and then the track, like looking in the color, it blended into like the lane, but the MIDI notes was the color, and I couldn't edit or change any parameters. So I ended up deleting the track and having to redo it, which I didn't want to do, but I couldn't figure it out.
Let me see something here. Is it this one here?
Yes. Yeah, that one.
Oh, you're saying this right here?
Yes.
Okay. That's not a problem. Okay, great. So if you look right here, right, this is what you did. So this is what you can see inside of the track. This is your track view. And for MIDI instruments, it has all of these different options. These are the same that are on the track, the MIDI editor lanes, except you don't see clips down there. So if, for example, if I hit blocks, this will just become a solid block. You won't see those notes in there. These are notes, velocity, MIDI volume. So you could see all of these parameters in your track. But right now, for our MIDI instruments, we're using clips as our view. And I'm going to say this because you could tell a lot about a person's work by what they hand in, right? So back when we used to write music out by hand, I used to get the first couple of, I had to rush through the first couple of chorales that I had to harmonize. And the music was great, but I didn't pay attention to the way I wrote it. And the teacher gave it back to me without a grade and says, you have to recopy this because I'm not going to try to decipher this garbage. Right. And he said, get us a flat edge, a small ruler, and use that to help draw your notes. So I did that. And I made sure for that going forward that my notes looked legible. I took care of the small details, right? So that attitude needs to be prevalent on your entire musical making output. Paying attention to details, paying attention to the way something looks. You know, for the jazz students here, when you perform, does Antonio tell you to wear jeans and a t-shirt? No, he wants you to wear a sport jacket. Or he wants you to wear nice clothes because the presentation is part of the experience. So, for example, when you go to Carnegie Hall, everybody's wearing like the suit, sport, tuxedos, gowns, everything, because it's being presented that way. And that's because that's the kind of music that it's appropriate to be dressed like that historically, right? Now, obviously, in 2023, if you go to a club, somebody could be wearing jeans and a t-shirt. There's not a problem with that. But my point here is that the presentation shows that you are paying attention to detail. And if you look at any great piece of art, the artist, even in anything, they are paying attention to detail on so many levels. Let me show you something. And okay, so this is a cubist collage by Picasso, right? And you look at this and you think that these things are all randomly placed. Right? But they're not. They're very carefully placed on something called the rule of thirds. And in art, what the rule of thirds does is it breaks up a surface into basically a tic-tac-toe board. And you're supposed to have your points of interest around that grid. So that if we look at this like this, where I quickly drew in something, you can see, right, that things are very carefully laid out. Now, there is some overlap. It's not like a mechanical machine, but it's very carefully planned where things happen on that grid all around there. That's because he's paying attention to detail in the background structure. Even things that look random. If they're a great piece of art, they've got that in there. So with that, that's why I want people to use clip view here and do your MIDI editing in the MIDI editor. Because if you have something that looks like this, right, where every one of these things is set to a different bit, right? To me, that's sloppy. It's really sloppy. And it's hard to get an overview as to what's going on. When you have something that looks like this, it's very easy to get an overview of everything that's going on. And it just looks good, you know, especially you hit your return, you got everything in the field of view. You know, like did this, right? An engineer or somebody else could open that up and it reads like a book, like a movie. It's beautiful. All right. So with the remainder time of the class, we're going to take a look at more advanced MIDI editing. Okay. So right here, I've got a drum performance, right? Now, obviously that sounds bad. It sounds horrible. Let's fix that. Now, I had you guys fixing that by dragging these notes onto the grid. Well, what you can do is you can select all of that. Now, notice that you could do Command A if you want to select the whole track, but I'm going to select just this little portion here. And there's a couple of ways that we've gone around doing that. You can just lasso the notes like that using the grabber tool, right? Click and drag. So that's this click and drag. And on your trackpad, click and drag. Well, you got to do it with 2 fingers. Whoops. Click and then drag. See, it's a little cumbersome with the trackpad. The mouse is a lot easier to do. Okay, so you can do that, or you can hover in the bar and beat ruler. Click and drag like that, and that'll select everything. So I'm going to select all of that, and then I'm going to do something called quantizing that. And what quantizing does is it puts something on a defined plane. I guess that's a good way to put it. So I'm looking here, and I've got eighth notes. This whole thing is filled with eighth notes. That's the smallest rhythmic subdivision. So let me get my keycaster up. I get that in the corner here so you can see it. So the key command is Option, Pro Tools, please. Option 0. And that brings up this window called Event Operations, right? Now, if we zoom in, you'll notice that there are many different event operations you can play around with. These are the ones 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are the ones that we're going to work on, and then we will work on step input at some point as well. We will do input quantize, but we're not going to do that from this window. This can also be found right here. Go to Event, and then there are all these different events, and you're going to go to Event Operations, and you can see these all here. And they all have, a few of them have key commands. All right. So all you have to memorize is Option 0, and then you can just pick the one that you want to work with. So quantize. So let me select these notes again. So we look at the quantize. And what to quantize? Note on note off. We don't need to worry about note off. I'm going to show you that in the later part of this. And this is our quantized grid, eighth notes. That's what that's what this particular bit has. And if you click on this, you get all these options, right? And this is very similar to clicking on this, right? It looks very similar. Or clicking on this or this, right? So Pro Tools is consistent in the way things look. You can, if you want something's a tuplet, you could have 3 in the time of 2. You could have 5 in the time of 4. You could have 4 in the time of 3. You can offset the grid, which I won't show you today, but I will show you. You can randomize. We're going to just do the quantized grid, and we're going to do swing and strength, right? So right now, I'm going to start on 8th note, and then I'm just going to hit apply, and then you saw everything moved over a little bit, and now I'll undo that, which is Command Z, and I'll zoom in a little bit, and you'll see all of these things move over, and it locks right on the grid. Okay, so that's now perfect, but that's not great because it's too mechanical. So let me undo that. And let me pick strength. And if I move the strength down to, let's say, 85, I think what happens is that it'll move everything that's off the grid 85% closer to the grid. So it won't fix it completely. It'll make it better. So if we zoom way in, we could see this note is a little bit before the grid, but this note's right on the grid. Right? So you could see that this hi-hat's a little before the grid. These are a little before the grid. This one's a lot before the grid. So it makes it better, but it doesn't make it mechanical. So that's strength. Let's undo that. Now, what we could also do is swing. So let me add swing. And it'll default to 100%. Right, like that. That's way too much. You want to go somewhere around 50%. I'll show you the difference. So let's do 50% swing. And then I'll hit apply. Right, and now we've changed the feel. Let me undo that and let me make the swing 75%. And this will, you see how it's a different feel? Let me undo that and let me make that 100%. Right, and you could combine swing and strength. And let me go back down to like 60% because I think that feels best, and make it 85%. Now, that's good. But what if I liked the way that these instruments sounded, right? But I thought that this could be a little tighter. Right, so let me show you how you would do that. So in other words, I'm selectively quantizing different parts of the drum kit. So if I could just lasso all these like this, or I could click here, and you see how all these are now selected, or I can just click and shift click, and right, and all these are now selected, but these are not selected. So I can apply this kind of swing to those. And then I can go right there, and that's my hi-hat, and I can make my hi-hat, let's say 80%, do that. And then these are my toms, so I can shift click on these. And maybe I'll make those 50%, right? So now I've got 3 different swing levels here, and let's hear what that sounds like. To me, that has the best feel. And you'll notice that right here, these guys are playing on the same beat, but this one is swung differently than this. That's like what a real drummer does, you know? Okay, so now while we're here, let's talk about velocity for a second. Are the hi-hats too soft, too loud, or just right? Thank you, Daniel.
You loud?
Yes, correct. So what we can do is by clicking on that F sharp, right? I selected all the hi-hats. We can go to Event Operations, and we can go to Change Velocity. And Change Velocity has all these options. You could set everything to one velocity, and then it would, it's sort of like what we did manually with the pencil tool. You can add or subtract. You can scale. You could change smoothly with a percentage. We'll go over some of that stuff. But right now, I'm just going to subtract. Let me do it exaggerated. So I'll subtract 50 from each one. That's better. All right. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. So that's one method of working. Now, what your assignment is going to be is you're going to download this session from our class folder, and you're going to do these same edits. All right. You're going to recreate these the best, put your own taste to it. You figure out your own quantizing percentage, swing, whether you want it straight or swing. You play around with that. That's your thing. One last thing I want to do with this drum thing is with drums or percussion instruments, you see how all my notes are different lengths? I like all the notes to be the same length on drums, and I will show you why in a second. But so I'm going to call back my quantize, my event operations. I'm going to change duration. And we're going to do right now, we're going to set all to 0. I'm going to set all these to 16th note. So that's 240. And now you see everything is the same length. The reason I like the way this looks is this reminds me of programming a drum machine, a hardware drum machine. So let me show you what I mean by that. This is an instrument that we're going to learn to program called Boom. And over here are our patterns. And there are 16 columns here. And in each column, you've got a row for each instrument. And you notice that all these, they're the same length, right? It just gives you the appearance of that, and it's just easier to see and work with. So that's something that I really feel strongly about. It doesn't change the sound because it just hits the sound and the whole sound plays, whether you are playing a note that's 10 beats long or a note that's a 30-second note. It's just going to play the sound. So for example, if you look at what I'm doing here, why is it not playing anything back? Bummer. My keyboard's, oh, I see why. Never mind. Give me 1 second. Okay. So, playing that snare drum, right? I'm playing that note really fast. I'll hold the note down. No difference in the sound. So, with percussion sounds, I like this method myself personally, but that's how you would do that. Okay, let's look at this. This is something fast strings. Now, let me show you something about the MIDI editor here. You see how I can't fit everything, all the notes in visual here? If we go over here, you'll see that there are these two bars. And I'm clicking on the top. You see how it made it smaller? Clicking on the bottom. So now everything sort of fits in there, and I can see all that. Okay, so let's take a look at our velocity here. I want this to crescendo, right? So let's select all this. Well, let's go to our velocity thing. So we'll open this up and we'll change velocity, right? So if I want everything to be softer, let's say I subtracted 50, you'll watch. You see the shape of this? It's going to have a similar shape. But it's going to be low. The stalks are going to be lower. So if I apply it, you see it's got a similar shape, all these stalks, right? But let's say I wanted to do like a gradual crescendo. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring all of these down like this, right? I just grabbed and dragged them all down and now they're all flat. I'm going to change smoothly by percentage. So I want to do 100% of that so that it stays the same. And I'm going to go up to 400%, right? So let's see what happens. You see now there's a crescendo there. Can I go higher than 400%? 400 is the maximum, right? Okay. So what if I brought this up a little, and let's say I started from 50% to 400%. See, now I go up too high. So maybe I have to go from 50% to like 300%. And there, I've got a nice crescendo from beginning to end. Now, what I can also do is there's a curve here, right? You see the shape there? So now if I redo that, you should get something that looks more like a parabola. Right? You see how that's now shaped? That's pretty, oh, my face is in the way, sorry. Let me get off the screen. You see how that's now shaped like a parabola? Well, let's undo that and let's change the shape. And now let's try it. That looks nice. Let's try this from 25%. And we'll make the curve 30. Hit enter and then hit apply. And that's a much nicer way of making an orchestral crescendo, I think, than doing this. Right. That might work in some situations, but right, that's like really cool where you're sort of rushing towards the end to the crescendo. It's like a different kind of effect. All right. So that's pretty cool. Oh, no, we don't want that yet. Not yet. All right, so here we've got a choir. And you'll see that all the notes are sustaining, right? And that's typically because I'm using a sustain pedal, right? If I select all this, and then I open up Quantize and I go change note duration. If I want that all to be legato where there's no space between the chords, I can select legato and I can have an overlap of 0. And then notice here, transform sustain pedal to duration. And then you delete the sustain events after transform. And boom, I've got that, right? Now, you'll notice though that there's some overlap here still, right? And that may or may not sound good depending upon the sound you're using. And also my sustain pedal has been deleted. So if you want to get rid of that, there's a couple of ways of doing it, right? So I could overlap, not transform sustain pedal to duration, and I can have them overlap with no value for the overlap, and I could hit enter, and then that sort of cleans that up, right? You see now they move one right into the other, all right? Or another way you can do that is you can go to Quantize, and you can quantize the note off as well as the note on. Or you could just quantize the note on. I mean, the note off. You could turn that off. Okay. So I'm going to quantize everything here, and I'm not going to swing. And I'm going to make it to quarter notes. And then when I hit enter, you'll notice that they also don't overlap anymore. Okay, let me make this bigger. Now, there's one thing additionally I need to do here is this just needs to be dragged out. Now, there's also something that we can do here. If I set all these to one velocity, go to change velocity, and let's say I set all to 50, right? You notice that this is all 50 now. If I want to bring out the melody, I can go here and I can do this function called select split notes. And the one that I'm going to teach you is top and bottom. So if I do the top one note of each chord, and then I apply that, you'll see the top line is all selected. If I want to make that louder so it sings out, at this point, I can just grab this and drag it up. Now, what if I wanted to transpose the bottom two notes of each chord down an octave? All right, let's see how we can do that. So if I select all that and I go bottom and I type in the number 2 and then I apply, Now you'll notice that this got selected also because those moved. So it thinks of it as that's a chord. So to fix that really quickly, and again, this is why you need to know all this stuff. You hit the grabber tool, hold the shift key down, and just select those, just drag over those, and those stop being selected. So now I've got all this stuff, and then I can just, you know, shift and the arrow goes down, and then now. Now, you can do that internally as well. So let's say that I want the tenor voice here to be softer. I could just select all those, and I could select the top one note of each of those like this, right? You see that they're selected. And then I can just bring the velocity on those down so that the tenor voice is quieter. Okay, good. So here I've got a little piano bit. All right, so let's do a crescendo like we did before. So we'll do option 0, and we will get up our change velocity, and we're going to use. I don't want it to get louder than this, so I'm going to. The last thing is going to be 100%, so it'll be this. The end will still be the same velocity as this, and we'll do that same curve. And see now it'll. A little bit too much. So let's make this from 50% to 100. Okay. Now, if I wanted to make, I'm just playing fifths in the key of C. So I'm basically playing dyads. C and G. Right? What if I wanted to play diatonic seventh chords going up stepwise? Well, let's take a look at this, right? So if I select all of these and I option drag them so that the top note goes up to the pitch that I want it to, let's see what happens. Right, that's not giving me what I want because that's giving me major seventh chords, except this one here got a little weird. But you see, right, I transposed by interval. So I copied and transposed by interval. So there's another way that you can do this. So I'm in the key of C. Well, up here, we can go right like this, and we can add key. Okay, and that's just like markers. So I'm right here. I'm going to select key, and it's going to be C major. Hit OK. And you'll notice that we've got a ruler that says C major. So if I select this and I copy that, I'm going to do option T, which brings up transpose, or you could just do option 0 and then scroll down to here. You've got all of these options here. So let's say I wanted to transpose everything up an octave. I could do that just from here like we could before. Right? I want to transpose it down 3 octaves. No problem. You can take every one of those notes. Well, I'll show you that another time. But we're in the key of C, right? So you could transpose in key. Let's see what happens if I do 3 scale steps. Okay, great. And if I merge paste that other bit back, what happened there? Let me copy that, apply, and then merge paste. Right? So I went up a fourth. So let's do 2 scale steps. And now merge paste. Well, that's not the major 7th chords, but that's all diatonic, whatever that is, right? So that's really cool. Now, let's say I had, let me do something here. Let me delete all these. So I want you to do something diatonic transposition and changing those into 4 voice chords. I can select all these notes here. And if I want to make them all the same pitch, I can select that pitch here, and then boom, they're all the same pitch. Okay, so that's that, but I want that to be 4-part chords there. More drums, right? Really bad sounding drums. Sounds like me playing. Definitely not Elvin Jones, Max Roach, Steve Porcaro, John Bonham. Yeah, James Brown's drummers, anything. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get my duration. Oops, sorry, excuse me. Set all to 240. Now, let's go to Quantize. So we've worked on swing, right? So if I make this like, let's say 57. Whoops. Note off. Make sure you've got that. Okay. Oh, wait. Hold on a second. Let's do 8th notes, right? Nope. So it's 16th notes. So you got to know what your resolution is, right? Otherwise, it'll be making mistakes. And that sounds better, right? Let's undo that. So we're at 16th notes. If we look here, there are things called, these are groove quantizing. So there's Cubase style grooves, right? Field injectors, Logic, MPC, and whoa, Pete grooves. I'm going to show you how to make your own grooves later in the semester. But let's start Logic style grooves. So it's 16th notes, right? So if we do Logic swing 16 and we make the timing 90%, we can apply it and we get something that sounds like this. Right? That's interesting. That's not the same as a swing, right? But it's got a nice feel to it. Let's try Logic 16D. Right? A different feel. So these are things you have to just play around with till you get something you like. Let's undo that. And let's do MPC. So we'll do 57% swing. Again, a different feel. I've got some grooves that I've made. Do I have any swing ones here? Let's do Funky Drummer and see what that sounds like. So let's undo that swing. And we've got Funky Drummer. That's got a kind of a cool thing. So I have the James Brown Funky Drummer loop, and you're going to be working with that this semester. And so I made a groove template, and from that loop, and the timing is being used here. Okay, so for this one here, you're going to do a groove template thingy. Okay, so here I've got an electric piano. So what are those chords? I'd like to know those chords because I don't know what they are. I don't know notation. I can't figure them out, but I need to give this to somebody else to play. Right? Well, there is a notation software in Pro Tools that's very basic that you can play around with. But what you can do is you can create a chord chart in the rulers. So if we go here and we've got chords, right? So let me play that. Well, where are my chords? You could enter those chords in manually, and I'll show you how to do that at some point. But if you go to Event, there's an option here, Extract Chords from Selection. Click on that. Takes a second. And then boom. Let me go right here and let me zoom in. Now, it doesn't put them exactly where I've played them. And, right, that's not how I would spell that chord. Those are the notes, but that's not how I would spell it. So, but anybody could read that. One tip, if you're doing this on your own, if the chord is too short, duration-wise, it doesn't pick it up as well. All right, so you just have to be careful with that. Okay, so now next thing I'm going to teach you is I'm going to teach you a little bit of dynamic automation. And we're going to use the cutoff frequency for that. Now, if you have, let me add in, let me do this. So this will be the last bit. So, and then we're going to watch a little video, I think. All right, there's much more of a change here. Jeez, I was wondering why it wasn't as big. That's because I had the wrong track record enabled. Okay, let's do that same experiment. You see these frequencies up in this area here get softer faster. So that's changing the timbre. So the idea is that that's an expensive sample library, and that doesn't happen as much with these Xpand 2 libraries. So how do you simulate that? You simulate that by playing around with something called the cutoff frequency. So this is set up to a low pass filter. So that means that all the low frequencies will pass through and the higher frequencies get attenuated the more that you crank this up. So let me play this choir sound. And let me move this manually. See, the higher frequencies are getting cut down. And this one you should really see if I open up the frequency doohickey. So let's see. Let's get both of those up there. Okay, so you see how this fundamental here, and there are undertones, but these fundamental stays loud compared to all of these, right? So you're essentially simulating it. So if I right click on this, and I've set this up on yours to do the same thing, it says forget MIDI CC17. So that means that this is actually set to MIDI CC17. You can also set it to whatever number you want, but leave it at 17, like a Janis Ian song. And if you go here and you go to controllers At the bottom of the list, it says add/remove controllers. Click on that, and it brings up this here. And make sure you're on the Angels track. And just 17. Add 17. Hit OK. And then if we go back here, you'll notice that there is controller 17. So now I can draw in some dynamics. So if I wanted to do something like this, all right. As this moves, watch this parameter here. So that's good. But what you can also do to make that, to sell that even more, is you can go to expression and help it out, right? So I'm doing a crescendo, sustained, and a decrescendo of the first phrase, and then similar. And then let's bring this way down to a whisper, and let's see what that sounds like now. So you see how much more musical that is, right? Okay, so now what's the last one here? Okay, so this is also the sustain pedal bit here. So let's forget about number 10. So for the assignment for next week, just MAP students do 5 of these. Graduate students and any music majors that want to do 9 of all, not the first 9. Don't worry about the last one. I'll type it up tonight or tomorrow morning when I get up and send you a PDF so that's a little bit more specific. How does that sound?
Good.
So that's like an incredible amount of information today. I have a 15-minute video I'd like to play for you, but maybe that'll keep for next class. All right. It's really cool. It just got uploaded recently, and I found it really fascinating. All right. So I think that we're going to call it a day today, and I will most likely go over your projects on Saturday and upload the video on Saturday. I am going to be unavailable tomorrow. I'll be available enough to write out the assignment, but as far as working on schoolwork tomorrow, I won't be available, but I will be Saturday morning. All right. Yes, Daniel, 2 questions. You're going to ask me something that I don't know anything about?
Well, it depends. I don't know. 1 second. I just wanted to know the quantizing the swing. Do you know the exactly how much does it affected by the percentage in relation to the grid?
I
Or
know
should I
that
mess around and
you should
figure
mess
that out?
around. I know the higher the number, the more the note gets moved. Right?
Is there like a specific way it gets moved to the
Yeah, it
left
gets
or
well, everything that's on, like if your resolution is 1/8 notes, right? Everything that's on a beat stays on the grid. The second 1/8 note moves closer to the next beat. So if you've got a grid at beat 1, beat 1 480, and beat 2, any note that's on beat 1 and beat 2 stays there pretty much. The one that's on 1 480 gets moved closer to beat 2. And the higher the percentage, the closer to beat 2 it gets moved. So all the offbeats get moved. If it's 16th notes, right, then what's on the downbeat and the 8th note stay the same, and the 16th notes, the second 16th note and the fourth 16th note get moved to the next 8th note. And the higher the percentage, the closer. So something at 50 might be something like dum da dum da dum da dum. Something at 75 might be dum da dum da dum da dum. Right? So that's sort of the effect. I don't really think that it's necessary to know the exact number. I think it's necessary to be able to know when the right sound is coming out. That's and to know the general and to know the general concept that the higher the number, the more exaggerated the effect, and that it's moving the offbeats to the right on the timeline.
Gotcha. And I don't need to ask the second question. I figured.
All right, great. So everybody have a great weekend, and I will get everything. I'll get you the exact assignment in the morning, and I will upload everything on Saturday morning at some point.
Thank you very much.
Yep, you guys have a great night and great weekend, and enjoy Rufus Reed. I watched some of that today. It was really good. His master class.